Welcome to the Canadian Climate Change Risk Assessment Software. This is the first video entitled, What is an Assessment? For the purposes of the Canadian Climate Change Risk Assessment Software, users will want to assess risk for a number of scenarios. For each scenario, risk will be assessed by combining the likelihood of the scenario occurring and the severity of the consequence. Based on the assessed risk, your team may choose to apply controls to certain scenarios. In these cases, the controls will decrease the risk, either by lowering the likelihood or decreasing the severity of the consequence. The remaining risk after all controls are applied is referred to as the residual risk. One of the powerful features of the Canadian Climate Change Risk Assessment Software is that your organization can apply your own definitions of likelihood and consequence, and also how these two elements combine to compute the assessed risk. At this point, you may be asking yourself, what constitutes a scenario? For the purposes of the Canadian Climate Change Risk Assessment Software, a scenario is a combination of an aspect, a risk source, and a set of impacts. An aspect can be any feature of your business that may be affected by climate change. It can be an asset, like a specific culvert, or a class of assets, like the type of asphalt used on roadways. Similarly, an aspect could be a service, like road clearing, graveling, or any other type of maintenance. In this sense, the Canadian Climate Change Risk Assessment Software uses a very loose definition of the word aspect. The choice of what you include and what you don't will be entirely up to you and your team. A risk source can be any feature of climate change that you feel may affect your business. Extreme rainfall is often identified as a concern of climate change. A table provided here shows how a business might classify increasing severities of extreme rainfall. A business might use a table like this to identify frequencies of these events to inform their decision about the likelihood of this event over present and future time horizons. Tables like these are not the product of the Canadian Climate Change Risk Assessment Software. Instead, businesses would gather this sort of information before conducting their assessment. It is important to note that the Canadian Climate Change Risk Assessment Software does not provide any modeled climate change data. The information you use for your assessment is up to you, and you can gather that information for your assessment in the Canadian Climate Change Risk Assessment Software. Finally, impacts are defined as a series of outcomes that may result from the effects of a risk source on an aspect. A good way to think of impacts is to chain impacts together using the words leads to. If you put all of these elements together, you could get the following example. For culverts, extreme rainfall events will lead to flooding, which will lead to washout, which will lead to reparations needed. I'm sure at this point you can begin to imagine your own scenarios. Now we've discussed what scenarios mean in the Canadian Climate Change Risk Assessment Software. I'd like to now add an important dimension to this discussion: time. Most of the assessments in the Canadian Climate Change Risk Assessment Software are concerned with the change in risk across 2 or more time horizons. For a given scenario, you'll want to evaluate the change in risk between multiple horizons. The example here shows the time horizons as 2010 to 2040 and 2040 to 2070. Your business will then assess risk for both time horizons for a given scenario and identify any elevated risk. With elevated risk comes increased controls. This is the feature of the Canadian climate change risk assessment software that is valuable for decision makers and planners. Forecasting the costs associated with these elevated risk controls is a great way for your business to be prepared for the future. In review, if we again ask ourselves, what is an assessment? We have a better answer. An assessment evaluates risk for a variety of scenarios over multiple time horizons. The goal of this evaluation is to identify increased risk and provides a way for your team to forecast the time and resources needed to implement the controls needed to adapt or mitigate these elevated risks. Let's turn our attention to the Canadian Climate Change Risk Assessment Software website. It can be found at c3ras.ca. In order to log into the site, you will need to have a valid account on the system. When you log in, you'll be presented with the list of assessments for your organization. To create a new assessment, click the New button found in the toolbar. This video has described what an assessment is in terms of the Canadian Climate Change Risk Assessment software. If you require more information, please refer to the left-hand side column. You will find a link to other videos, as well as the user manual for the software. Thank you for watching. We hope you enjoy using the Canadian Climate Change Risk Assessment software.